Okay, so last we left off, we saw that there was trouble in Europe, Western Europe, with the breakdown of the power of the papacy. That by the time you get to the 15th century, the papacy has survived the Babylonian captivity in France, and now you do have a pope back in Italy, but definitely the political power of the papacy has suffered. So other things that start to lead to the quote unquote beginning of the modern world is the troubling of just generally the both the Eastern and Western world by the Mongol invasions. So the main figure that starts this talk is Genghis Khan. Um, his name is Temujin. His years are 1162 to 1227, and he has a really interesting story. In fact, the main thing you need to know about him was he was a guy who took this kind of improbable rise to power, and then he was able to unite all these different Mongolian groups and create this like fighting machine that spread across the globe. And we'll reference a map later on looking how much of the globe he took. Um, well, I'd say he took. He eventually dies before the Mongol Empire really expands, and then after its expansion throughout the known world, you get these khanates that are established. Now, why this is such an important topic, especially as we're talking about moving into early modern times, is that trade routes are established. So once the invasions are all pretty much taken care of, you have this connection once again between the Eastern world, China included, with the Western European world, and obviously the African world. So if you remember back way back early part of the semester with Rome and China, the Silk Roads, and how the detachment of east to west leads to what historians call, some historians at least, still call the Dark Ages in Western Europe. Well, this is another point of kind of bringing everything back um, together again. And so Genghis Khan is an extremely important character. I'm going to post a short video on him and the Mongols um, as a with this lecture later, so you can check that out as well to learn more. So that's another thing that is moving medieval society into a modern world. Next would be the plague that hits most of the world. So now you have this connection with trade, but eventually this connectivity brings about this plague that kills about a third of the population of Europe. So the plague, and this is a test question, the plague starts somewhere in the east, is brought over in to the west with on ships. At least the prevailing wisdom is that these are ships that set port in Italy and on fleas on rats, and that's how the plague spreads. And it's what's called the Black Death is so disastrous for global society that people would die within like 24 hours after getting the plague. I mean, practically whole villages were wiped out by this desolation. So this produces so much just change in just even the population of Europe. I would direct you to the video over here in your slides. Definitely watch this video on the plague. It kind of covers different areas that are impacted. So that's another point on just general major historical events that start to shift the world into the modern age. The last one is particular to Europe. This deals with this interfighting between the French and the English for years, all the way back to like the Norman invasions. England and France have been at each other's throats over land and power and cultural influence. Um, and This leads into what's known as a Hundred Years' War. Uh, Early on the Hundred Years' War, the English get the upper hand. And then what's famous at tail end of the war is the rise of the figure of Joan of Arc, or I should say Saint Joan of Arc, and France eventually gaining its autonomy. And you're starting to have what historians see as the kind of national identity of both England and France take place. Especially like Joan's such an interesting figure, for a lot of reasons, but the main one here is the fact that she's very much a kind of a prototypical nationalist, and through her brand of mysticism, backs up the Dauphin, and eventually he becomes king. And then of course Joan's martyrdom is infamous in history. So but regardless of that, the big thing to take away from this is that if you think about modern history, so you move into like World Civ 2, both France and England are like major players in global politics. So part of this shift and the rise of these two soon to be nation states, like concretely nation states, the roots of it are at the Hundred Years' War. Um, so, kind of wrapping things up, as I mentioned at the beginning, definitely the problems with the papacy that we talked about last week. This has led to the kind of the breakdown of the power of the church, at least the central power of the church. So that means the Reformation is just around the corner, and you can kind of see why in certain places it's going to be successful. The Mongol invasions have basically upset what was kind of the standard situation across the globe for centuries. And through this, now you have this connection with the Eastern world and the Western world with what's these trade routes, or what's known as Pax Mongolica. Um, then you have this plague that hits, famous Black Death, that kills so many people globally. And so, because of that, as the video shows, many people resorted to new technologies. There's less people to feed. You start to get the rise of craftsmen and guilds and things like that. So the peasantry is getting a little bit more of a voice, and so and especially like in the Italian states, a certain era of freedom and mobility is going to lead into the Renaissance. And then finally, the creation of, or at least the beginning of national identity is one of the effects from the Hundred Years' War, and that'll have a big impact on future history.